In 1742, a much larger war broke out in Europe. The War of the Austrian Succession, as it was known, was another conflict over succession, this time triggered by the death of Emperor Charles VI of Austria. The question of who would inherit his Habsburg lands pitted Austria, Britain, and Russia against an alliance that included France, Prussia, and Spain. The conflict quickly spread to their overseas empires. In North America, the conflict was called King George's War. As before, French and English colonists prepared to fight, drawing their native allies, the Wabanaki Confederacy with the French and the Iroquois with the British, into the fray. The fighting again centered on control of the strategically vital St. Lawrence River and the contested region of Acadia. In 1745, the British colonists achieved their most significant victory in decades of warfare by capturing the mighty French fortress of Louisbourg, which guarded the entrance to the St. Lawrence. Fighting also raged in New York and New England, taking a heavy toll on the colonists, especially in the war's final years. When the war ended with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748, the British colonists were outraged. The treaty, focused on restoring a balance of power in Europe, returned Louisbourg to the French in exchange for a French withdrawal from territories in the Low Countries. After years of bloody sacrifice, the colonists had gained nothing. The borders remained exactly as they were before the war. Territorial disputes festered, old grudges intensified, and the violent struggle for control of the North American wilderness continued unabated between English colonists, French colonists, and Native American tribes. The fundamental issue remained unresolved: the vast, undefined borders between the ever-expanding British and French empires. The stage was set for a final, decisive confrontation. This skyrocketing value of the Americas directly led to the next imperial conflict. The War of Jenkins' Ear, as it became known, originated from long-simmering commercial rivalries. The British were deeply frustrated by Spain's mercantile control over trade with its South American and Caribbean colonies. For their part, the Spanish were angered by what they saw as illegal British encroachment on territory they considered theirs north of Florida, especially after the founding of the colony of Georgia in 1721. Tensions escalated as Spanish patrol vessels began stopping and searching British merchant ships in the Caribbean for contraband, a practice permitted by past treaties, but deeply resented. In 1731, the British brig Rebecca was stopped off the coast of Cuba. During the search, Spanish officials discovered an illegal cargo of sugar. The ship's captain, Robert Jenkins, later alleged that he was tortured by the Spanish, who, he claimed, cut off his ear. Although the Royal Navy privately acknowledged that Jenkins was at fault for smuggling, his dramatic testimony before Parliament in London ignited a firestorm of public outrage. In 1739, citing Spanish depredations against British subjects, Prime Minister Robert Walpole reluctantly declared war on Spain. The conflict, largely focused on the Caribbean and South America, saw the British Navy attempt to capture key Spanish ports and forts. On the North American mainland, fighting between the British colonists in Georgia and the Carolinas and the Spanish in Florida was inconclusive. Once again, the heaviest toll was likely paid by the Native American tribes who were drawn into the fighting on both sides. For nearly 3 decades following the treaty, a period of relative peace settled over the major European powers in North America. This era allowed the British colonies to flourish and grow increasingly complex. They developed their own robust colonial governments and expanded a thriving North American economy built on agriculture, textile production, and a bustling maritime trade. As the value of these mainland colonies rose, so too did that of their South American and Caribbean counterparts. The discovery of vast gold and silver deposits in South America and the development of sugar plantations in the Caribbean, producing commodities like molasses that were now essential in Europe, created immense wealth. This economic engine, however, was fueled by the brutal and inhuman institution of slavery. By the early 18th century, the American colonies were deeply enmeshed in what was known as the triangular trade. European ships, often from England, carried manufactured goods to Africa, where they were traded for enslaved people. The enslaved Africans were then transported across the Middle Passage to the Americas. There, The ships would sell the survivors and take on cargoes of sugar, molasses, tobacco, and cotton. These goods were then shipped to New England and Europe, completing the triangle. This cycle of trade, built on the grotesque sale of human lives, grew ever more profitable and entrenched. Slavery was rampant throughout the Caribbean and South America and was rapidly expanding in the North American colonies as well. From the early 1600s to the mid-18th century, the scale of this human tragedy exploded. The number of enslaved Africans imported to the Americas surged from an estimated 300,000 between 1600 and 1625 to over 2 million in the quarter century between 1751 and 1775. In the South, English colonists from the Carolina province engaged the Spanish in Florida and the French in Louisiana. The fighting in this region was particularly devastating for the local native populations caught between the warring powers, and it ultimately helped solidify England's hold on the future colony of Georgia. In New England, the Wabanaki Confederacy, again siding with the French, launched relentless raids that plagued the settlements of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. A major English military expedition once again failed in its objective to capture Quebec, though it did make significant and lasting gains in Acadia. While the fighting in North America had little bearing on the war's final outcome in Europe, the 13 years of continuous conflict had a profoundly destructive impact on communities across the continent, both native and colonial. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 brought the war to an end. As part of the settlement, France was forced to cede vital territories to England, including the Hudson Bay region, Acadia, renamed Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland. These concessions, made in European capitals, completely ignored the native nations who had fought on both sides, sowing the seeds for future grievances and conflicts. Fighting erupted as English-backed Iroquois warriors launched attacks on French settlements, while the French-allied Wabanaki retaliated against English frontier towns. As professional French and English soldiers began to arrive in the New World, the colonists of New England and New France mobilized for a broader confrontation. This conflict, known in the colonies as King William's War, dragged on for nearly a decade. The fighting saw French successes in the New York colony and English gains in Acadia, later Nova Scotia, and along the St. Lawrence. Yet, neither side could capture their ultimate prize. For the French, it was Boston. For the English, the strategic linchpin of Quebec. The war sputtered to a close in 1697 with no clear victor. But King William's War was merely the opening act. It was the first of 4 major imperial conflicts between France and England, wars that would systematically draw on their respective Native American allies and wreak havoc on the continent for the next half-century. The fragile peace was not destined to last. In 1701, the death of King Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg monarch, without a direct heir, triggered a European diplomatic crisis. A complex web of secret treaties and competing claims left the powerful Spanish thrown up for grabs. England, Austria, Prussia, and the Dutch Republic scrambled to prevent the French Bourbon dynasty from seizing control of the vast Spanish Empire. This dispute ignited the War of the Spanish Succession. In North America, it was called Queen Anne's War, and it did not take long for the fighting to arrive. Leading a powerful alliance of Algonquian tribes, Matacomet's forces struck. Their targets were not only the isolated farmsteads on the New England frontier, but also the larger, more established colonial towns. With no regular English army stationed in America, the defense of the colonies fell to local militia units. These forces quickly adopted a brutal strategy, targeting native villages to destroy their ability to wage war. The conflict, known as King Philip's War, was short but exceptionally bloody. In 1676, just a year into the fighting, Matacomet was killed. His death was a catastrophic blow, effectively decapitating the native resistance. Leaderless and demoralized, the Wampanoag and their Narragansett allies were systematically crushed by the New England militia, their people scattered, and their power in the region broken forever. It stood as the bloodiest war in North American history. In the immediate aftermath of this devastating conflict, tensions between the English colonists and their French and Dutch rivals to the north intensified. Witnessing the fate of their southern neighbors, 5 native tribes north of New England formed the Wabanaki Confederation in the late 1680s. Their primary goal was to present a united front against English expansion, a move that inherently increased friction with the colonists. By 1689, a mere 2 years after King Philip's War concluded, a new cycle of violence began, this time ignited by the imperial ambitions of the European mother countries. As the 18th century dawned, the patchwork of European settlements across North America continued to expand and solidify. The great powers were systematically carving up immense territories for themselves, their claims formalized through a series of treaties and agreements made across the ocean. These arrangements, however, were consistently crafted with a blatant disregard for the continent's original inhabitants, the numerous native nations with their own intricate systems of land tenure, alliance, and governance that had existed for centuries. In response, many Native Americans resisted. Acting as shrewd opportunists in a rapidly changing world, various tribes navigated the complex landscape by forming and breaking alliances with both European settlers and rival indigenous groups. This often sparked violent conflict. Raids on isolated colonial settlements were a recurring reality, and the colonists could rarely depend on their distant European protectors to mount a timely or effective defense against such threats. One of the most brutal and consequential of these conflicts erupted in 1675. In the colony of New England, a catastrophic breakdown in diplomacy led to all-out war between the colonists and the Wampanoag tribe, along with their allies. Metacomet, the son of the Massasoit who had forged a peace with the Plymouth Pilgrims, had risen to become the Grand Sachem of the Wampanoag Confederacy. Unlike his father, he viewed the growing English presence with deep apprehension. Disputes over wandering livestock, the relentless encroachment onto Wampanoag ancestral lands, and the aggressive efforts of colonial missionaries to convert his people to Christianity proved to be the final provocations. For Metacomet, the settlers were no longer potential allies but a clear and present danger. The patchwork of European settlements across North America continued to expand and solidify. The great powers were systematically carving up immense territories for themselves, their claims formalized through a series of treaties and agreements made across the ocean. These arrangements, however, were consistently crafted with a blatant disregard for the continent's original inhabitants, the numerous native nations with their own intricate systems of land tenure, alliance, and governance that had existed for centuries. In response, many Native Americans resisted. Acting as shrewd opportunists in a rapidly changing world, various tribes navigated the complex landscape by forming and breaking alliances with both European settlers and rival indigenous groups. This often sparked violent conflict. Raids on isolated colonial settlements were a recurring reality, and the colonists could rarely depend on their distant European protectors to mount a timely or effective defense against such threats. One of the most brutal and consequential of these conflicts erupted in 1675. In the colony of New England, a catastrophic breakdown in diplomacy led to all-out war between the colonists and the Wampanoag tribe, along with their allies. Metacomet, the son of the Massasoit who had forged a peace with the Plymouth Pilgrims, had risen to become the Grand Sachem of the Wampanoag Confederacy. Unlike his father, he viewed the growing English presence with deep apprehension. Disputes over wandering livestock, the relentless encroachment onto Wampanoag ancestral lands, and the aggressive efforts of colonial missionaries to convert his people to Christianity proved to be the final provocations. For Metacomet, the settlers were no longer potential allies but a clear and present danger.